So welcome everyone. This is Let's Talk with JMO, and I'm JMO, and this is Goyland Williams, a former professor of mine from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. How's it going, Goyland?
That's going pretty good, Jimmy. I can't complain too much.
So why don't we start off here with you telling us a little bit about yourself?
All right. So, hi, my name is Goyland Williams, as Jimmy mentioned. I am a native Texan who's sort of been found his way to the Northeast by way of graduate school and academia in general. A little bit about me. As I mentioned, I come from Texas, mainly from a family of hardworking, um, middle class folk who grew up on farms. And so I sort of think about that a lot when I think about my approach and my perspective, that I'm really coming and thinking from sort of people who are often excluded, people who are at the sort of margins or the outskirts of society, and people who literally sort of understand that sort of bootstrap mentality. And so I try to think of myself as somebody who's a product of that um, culture and of that specific social location. Um, I'm largely interested, I think, in questions of race, gender, class, but really I try to think particularly about the ways that black men in particular are vulnerable to these sort of social structures in ways that we often don't talk about. So whether you're talking about sports, whether you're talking about hip hop, whether you're talking about literature or film and television, you often see black men often being at the sort of bottom of society, subjected to intense police brutality, subjected to poverty, subjected to social isolation, subjected to joblessness, homelessness, right? And yet we don't really have an academic or political language to talk about black men in particular as being vulnerable, but rather we think of black men as sort of criminals. And so my research and my own sort of activism sort of seeks to sort of challenge those types of narratives. So I
Uh,
think that's who I am in a nutshell.
yeah. I think that well sums it up. I mean, would you like to just say that about your academic life in terms of how you got to UMass, and like what your specific research not is, because you kind of just said that, but in terms of like your like I'm com or communications, like stuff like that.
Oh, okay, cool. Thanks. So yeah, I sort of have a roundabout way, I think, to UMass. I initially began undergraduate at Texas State University in the Hill Country of Texas, on Central Texas, on a speech and debate scholarship. At that point, I was a philosophy and political science double major, who was largely interested in questions of international politics and um, existential philosophy. So, for example, my undergraduate honors thesis looked at the politics of democracy in Botswana, and I made the argument that rather than seeing Botswana as a model for democracy for other African nations, that Botswana was positioned as a sort of unique case. So it could not be a model that you could map necessarily onto other African nations without considering the sort of political economy of those nations. That led me, after a short time off, so maybe a year off of undergraduate, that led me to the University of Kansas in Lawrence, where I initially went to pursue a degree in philosophy with a focus on Africana philosophy. Um, but once I got there, things did not work out necessarily in that department, and I changed my interest. And so I ultimately went across the street there and went over to the African American Studies department and pursued a master's in African American Studies with a focus on literature, Black literature in particular. And Toni Morrison and James Baldwin were two authors that I focused on in my research. And so the questions that sort of followed me from undergraduate to there were questions about suffering, right? And back to this sort of vulnerability category, thinking about Black suffering and how those themes were prevalent in their literary works. Um, I didn't have enough, I guess, of graduate school at Kansas, and I found myself maybe the last semester there. I found myself in a rhetoric of Black Americans course, and I was like, "Oh, this is what I've been trying to do all my life," and I didn't know it, and I guess I had to take the roundabout way to get back to communication. Um, and so I finished the master's at Kansas, immediately left, I believe, in May of 2014. I'm dating myself here. I left in May of 2014 and immediately started another master's program in June of 2014 back at Texas State, where I competed as an undergraduate and did a master's in communication because, for several reasons, Texas State's master's program has a top ranked master's program in the country in communication that's easily has been ranked nationally in the top three um, pretty much every year. So it's pretty rigorous. So I knew that I would get some good theoretical training. And those are areas that I felt sort of inadequate in, thinking about sort of theory and how I can apply theory to thinking about Black people in particular in sort of questions about social movements, right? Protest, resistance, um, organizational communication, right? So those are the research interests that I sort of found at Texas State were really thinking about questions about Black protest. So almost similar in certain ways, but not necessarily similar to what I have found at Kansas. And then after Texas State, um, I took off 2 years. I was exhausted from school, as one might imagine. Took off 2 years. Moved to New York with my best friends that I had met in high school and college. So we've been knowing each other at that point for well over almost 10 years. And moved to New York, taught 1 year at the City University of New York, or the specific school was New York City College of Technology, I believe. I taught public speaking there as an adjunct. So it was temporary work. It was not a lot of pay. I think at most it may be $2,000 a month in New York. But
Jeez.
my friends were the bond. So I slept on their couch for almost 2 years, and it was great because we loved each other. So that really helped a lot. And I really, after that year, I moved on to Seton Hall University as a full-time lecturer and a assistant director of forensics, basically assistant debate coach, speech and debate coach, where I traveled with a nationally ranked speech team almost every weekend for the whole year of 2017, 2018. Um, I believe. And then haphazardly, I had always had my eye on UMass for some strange reason. Like, I didn't really know, to be quite honest, why UMass Amherst was always like, oh, I always kept it on my list of like institutions I should know or be affiliated with. And so when I was thinking about PhD programs, I had delayed it already at that point for 2 years. And so I was in LA with a friend, one of my best friends, and we I was like, I'm gonna submit the application. It was two places, and I submitted my application, and I really didn't think I was gonna be competitive. I didn't hadn't taken retaken the GRE or anything. It had been like 6 years ago. It was almost about to expire. It wasn't a good score. In fact, it was not good at all. But I felt very confident about my writing samples, my recommendations, and whatever. And so I submitted my application to UMass, and a few weeks later, I got a really good offer that I could not refuse. Um, and I visited the campus. I remember it was raining. It was March at that point. It was really gray. I was like,
Really,
oh
really
God.
cold.
It was cold. It wasn't really, really cold, but it was cold. And I was like, what have I gotten myself into? Because in certain ways, Kansas was almost like exactly like that, but maybe a little worse. But I didn't visit Kansas; I just showed up, and so UMass. I knew once I visited, I felt weird that I was like, I I don't know if I want to do this, but it felt right. Specifically after talking to my advisor, I was like, I should be doing this. I should be here. and and so yeah, I let my job know that I wasn't coming back. So I didn't fill out the renewal forms because my position was a every year position where I
Yeah.
asked for renewal, and I didn't fill out those forms. And they're like, "What happened? Where are you going?" And so yeah, I decided to come to UMass, and I think it was the best decision for me. So sorry for spending a
Oh
lot of
no, no. I'm glad we could get some
but
background, and it really kind of shows that you have had a lot of had a lot of the different experiences. You've been all over the country, and I think that gains a lot of ground when we're talking about the stuff we're going to talk about today too. And um,
absolutely, yeah, absolutely,
without going much further into just different topics, I think what you're studying is very interesting, especially to the modern climate. And that's part of the reason I wanted to have you come on, just because things seem so hectic now, and maybe you can help shed some positive light on the situation, and we maybe can talk about coming to terms with what we got going on in the United States today.
absolutely.
So why don't we start off with something along the lines talking about the nature of the movements going on in terms of Black Lives Matter and its grips with coronavirus and the protests going on. So what are your major thoughts on that to start?
Cool, Jimmy. It's a big one, but I'll take a gander at it. I'll take a stab at it, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. Um, I think we find ourselves in a peculiar, um, in a unique point in history. Maybe a lot of people are proclaiming that we've never seen right a time like this in which our nation was embattled by right a health crisis, economic crises, right a crisis of the soul, if you will, right racism, white supremacy, um, social dysfunction, um, yeah, and a lack of moral and political courage by both sides, um, failure to adequately deal with the underside, right, or the bottom, right, of society, right, and sort of still continuing to champion dogmas and beliefs, right, that if only we cater to this middle class, right, this elusive middle class that no one, right, absolutely can define, right, and everyone swears that they are in, right, we keep believing that if only we keep pummeling money back into this middle class, back into this elite group of folk, right? This upper middle class, right? These rich folk and these corporations, that somehow we will magically find ourselves, right? Back stabilized, we will be okay, right? So we're embattled by these sort of type of discourses, and we've seen from history, right? All you have to do is study the Great Depression, right? After, or you could study, right, World War II, right? All these sort of major catastrophes in which you also sort of see economic crisis also happening at the same sort of time as these sort of social crises, right? All of that keeps missing the point that until you deal with, right, the most vulnerable people, right, the most vulnerable, right, people who are jobless, landless, right? People without homes, people who are working, right? Working the working poor, right? We talk, right, and we I don't think we talk enough about the working poor, people who literally go to work every day and still live paycheck to paycheck and cannot afford the basic necessities. Let's not even talk about wants. Let's not even talk about this luxury spending. People who cannot afford such things as paying their electric bills or their gas bills, right? Or even having enough food for to feed their kids, right? And yet we keep having these discussions about welfare for the rich, welfare of tax incentives for middle class folks, and we shun and we come up with all types of reasons why to cut social welfare policies for poor people. Right. And so
Yeah,
we don't have a very genuine discussion in our country about that. And we keep saying, oh, well, these people are just, bumming off the government, right? These people are bumming off the government. So what do you think the rich are doing, right? When you
exactly.
pay taxes, right? What do you think the rich is doing when they find every um, ability to, right, to scheme, right, around paying what they're supposed to be paying, right, to the country, to their cities, to their state taxes, right, to income taxes, right, and that's a whole nother discussion if we want to talk
Oh
about,
yeah.
I guess, the $750 question, right, about who's paying seven
Well,
hundred fifty dollars, right? So, um,
I think
yeah,
it's important to put it out there that it almost seems as though the middle class is much smaller than we're led to believe, and it's more of that upper middle class, more high class, whatever you want to call it, that is more has more wealth than the rest of the country. It's more just a lower and upper class at this point, because there are maybe a million or so like actual middle class, however you want to define that. But even people that are able to pay their bills, are most of them are still, at least in my position, like I'm able to pay my bills, but we're looking at people that are still living paycheck to paycheck. We're not saving up money. We're just getting by. And that's like, I feel like most of the country.
right. And if you look, Jimmy, sort of at data, at statistics, if you want to think about like debt, and even if you want to think about wages and salaries, most like we tend to think that as you get more education, like your salary goes up. We're not necessarily seeing that in our generation or in our lifetime, right? We see probably in the 70s and 80s, people were having, salaries that are still haven't been sort of changed since the 80s and the 70s, right? So we can't, teachers are still probably some of the same most underpaid folk, and people and other academics are most underpaid folks in this nation, despite, right, having more education, despite having more demands placed on them. There's not a lot of wiggle room there. You don't see them properly being compensated for labor. For labor, we don't want to talk about those type of things when we say teaching. Oh, we do it for passion. No, but you also have to pay your bills. You have a family, so unless you're married to someone wealthy or someone who can sort of help, right, pay bills, right, you're sort of stuck in the same sort of situation as you were when you went to college, right, without having enough money or enough
It,
resources. And then let's not talk about student loan debt, right?
oh yeah, and you could
That
see. Oh,
sort of
no
has
worries, no
further
worries.
sort of
Well, there's this
that
thing that like people don't realize, especially in terms of coronavirus, that the workers at supermarkets and stuff, I mean, they should be getting hazard pay because it's not just bagging groceries anymore. Now it's a job where you're bagging groceries, but you're an essential worker and you could die at your job, and they're getting minimum wage. I mean, for I know that's different than teaching, which we should be putting money into essential roles in terms of pushing our society forward in terms of education. Not to mention that education from kindergarten through 12th grade, it needs to be reformed completely because we're living in the 1950s in terms of how it grips with modern technology and the effects of that. And then if you go into student debt, we're looking at a form of suppression there that many people don't realize. I feel like we're living in sort of a world of smoke and mirrors, and I think that draws like kind of heavily into the division we're going with politics, also along with the lines of the division we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of this might be an unpopular opinion, but maybe we're being persuaded that maybe more people are on the same side than we're being led to believe. I, my question to you is: do you think that leadership is the difference in the problem? It's kind of a mirror of our politics at the moment. Like our politics don't have leadership really. It's just puppet heads at this point, and it's completely obvious, not just with Trump being a puppet head of corporations, but Biden being a puppet head of most blatant puppet head for the Democrats and whoever is backing him. I mean, he's not able to actually make the correct decisions he needs to. And if he gets elected, it's just proving the point with less smoke, you know? So I think that maybe a problem with that we're having in comparison to the civil rights movement is maybe there's not leadership in the Black Lives Matter movement. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that question or that you're posing is an interesting question, because I think you're absolutely right in some regards in terms of thinking about um, a failure or a crisis, right? As some scholars would say, a crisis of leadership. Um, and maybe we took leadership, and that's something that we take for granted. I think as a people, as American people, um, we scrutinize it, we subject it. Um, we assume that because you're a president or because you're in Congress that you're going to act right in the interest of the people, that you're going to lead people, that you're going to do the right thing, the moral, right, and responsible thing. That is no longer something that we can no longer assume. So maybe in so many ways that our masks have been pulled off, the smoke and the screen has been torn from our eyes, and maybe some of us are beginning to see more clearly the facade of political leadership and what that can mean and what it doesn't always mean. So I think that's one issue there of us not necessarily holding leadership accountable. So even if we want to talk about Obama, right, many of us, right, were happy, at least on the left, and in Black America in particular, many of us were happy to see representation for the first time, political representation, right, in terms of race or ethnicity, right, that a lot of us, right, and I'm not saying this is everybody because there's still a lot of people who held, black folk and Democrats and liberal folk who held Obama, his foot to the fire, so to speak. But a lot of us sort of went to sleep politically and said, "Oh, he's fine. He's a great leader, right? He knows he can speak well. He seems to be doing things that are in the interests, right, of a larger majority. So things like universal health care, right? Things it really relates to climate um, control, things related to, right? We were coming out of an economic depression, right? Again, during the Obama administration, and we were experiencing some of the greatest, right? Um, sort of increases in the economy, more jobs, right? But at the same time, right, we were seeing, right, some of these wars, right? We were seeing some, killings internationally, right? Things that were morally questionable. We didn't see any specific gains for Black Americans any more than we saw, right, for right the Clinton administration or the Reagan administration or the Bush administration, right? So Black America didn't benefit at all. If we want to talk very candidly about Obama's sort of administration, in ways that maybe we assumed that we would, right? In ways that white people were afraid that if Obama was elected, that he would, right, cater to Black Americans, and we didn't necessarily see that. So you saw this catering to a ultimately to a white middle class audience, who he sort of relied on for votes. As opposed to poor folks, right? So again, you see this sort of abandonment or this evasion of talking seriously, sort of about poverty. Cornel West, right? Tavis Smiley were some of Obama's sort of main critics on that sort of question, and I think there's some more complexities that we can talk about between their sort of beef there, but I think Cornel West was sort of spot on in thinking about liberalism and neoliberalism and how sort of Obama simply was sort of puppet head for that, for neoliberal policies, even though we thought he would actually be far more progressive and actually more radical than he was. Fast forward to sort of, sorry, and didn't
No,
mean to
no, go
interrupt.
ahead.
Fast forward to our sort of own like political moment now, right? We're definitely seeing a failure of leadership in terms of xenophobia, racism, white supremacy rearing its head again. And all of a sudden, we seem to be shocked as if this is something that politicians have never done. Again, Trump is his own brand of crazy, right? His own brand of sort of white supremacist,
Mhm.
but it's not very far off if we want to think about his relationship with,
Well,
right, or his similarities with Reagan and with
oh yeah.
Nixon, right? And so these things are not like isolated, right? So I sort of always try to think about continuity. Like, how does the presidency really serve as a vehicle for for continuity, right? So how are they the same, right, in
Yeah.
so many regards, even as they are
S-
markedly different, almost.
with that being said, I think there's a few different paths to go off here.
Okay.
Um, so the reason I bring up, because I'm a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement, and
Mhm.
but I think when I bring up the idea of a failure of leadership, it's not because they're doing it wrong, but there's we talked about this in our pre-interview that there's a problem of we're trying to fix a complex problem with simple solutions, and that's where the lack of leadership comes in, and we have to realize that we're not going to get complex answers to complex problems unless we have someone that can tote that for the entire movement rather than it just being ideas thrown out from here and there that don't pick up much ground because a simple message is easier to throw out there and get a slogan for.
Can I pick up on that, Jimmy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would slightly rephrase that, right? So I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily call this a sort of like leadership failure, more as I would call this a crisis of imagination. And by that, I simply mean think about the ways that our discourse of what we even think is possible, right? That's what imagination is. What are we willing to do for a better world? What alternative solutions can we imagine in the place of policing,
Mm-hmm.
right? What can we imagine in the place of um, prisons, right? So you're having discussions about abolition, right? Police discussions about abolish the police, about cut funding, right? Things. What are we imagining in place of, um, right? Throwing people, forgetting about the most vulnerable people. Can we imagine instead of saying, well, people are having these mental health crises, they should go to
Mm-hmm.
jail, right? How can we imagine mental health in new ways? How can we imagine, right, um, land justice in a new way? How can we imagine, right, economic justice in new ways? We have very punitive language for for social catastrophe,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so instead of we always think about punishing people for what happens to them, or more readily, what the state does to them or leaves them off to defend for themselves, and yet we are punishing people for being poor, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're punishing people for not being able to afford this American dream that we have made unaffordable in so many
And
ways.
very difficult for the lower class to even break into, let alone, especially in inner cities where we find a majority of minorities. And
Absolutely, but let's not forget rural areas,
oh,
right? I'm
that
a
too.
product of that, so I want
Mm-hmm.
us to remember that. Let's not
Mm-hmm.
forget rural areas, right? We always talk about the inner city, and I'm not saying that we've done justice for the inner city. We have not. Let's
Mm-hmm.
be clear. That's where it's most amplified. But if we want to talk about rural America, most Black Americans live in rural America, right, where there are absolutely very few resources in comparison to cities. For example, I live 50 miles south of Houston, right, in a very small town that had under 9,000 people.
Wow.
Um, Black and Latino was about a little bit less than half of that population. And then white was the sort of rest of that. And if we sort of use, and the town was called Warden, Texas. So if we use Warden as a sort of case study for thinking about social um, support or the lack thereof, we saw so much of it. Most of the people I went to school with were poor. or working class. Very few actual middle class folk. I mean, there were a few, people who had, had some sort of generational wealth due to cattle, right? Mainly farming. So I think there's something to talk about, put a pin to talk about sort of generational wealth. So unless you sort of come from a family that has had generational wealth, and by that I mean access to resources such as family that's passed down homes, family that's passed down sort of major insurance policies. Kids, if their parents die, they benefit. They get these insurance policies, and then they can go put a deposit down in their home, or their college is paid for, so they don't leave out of college in $70,000 worth of debt or $40,000 worth of debt. Right? They're starting with almost with a clean slate. You're not seeing that with most black and brown Americans because we don't have those type of generational sort of
Hmm.
resources. And so we think of college as being access to social mobility, right? Climbing up the ladder. If you look at the data in social science research and education policy research, we're actually seeing the opposite for black Americans, right, in particular. And I can imagine also, for
Lower
Latinx
income white
population,
class too.
right, in general, you might see that across the board, in which they're constantly being punished, right? So even when we get college degrees and advanced degrees, guess what? You usually have to send money back home to support, right, your immediate family members who don't have those sort of resources, because you have a sort of social and a communal sort of responsibility to your family, right? Because you're not a product of yourself. No man is an island unto himself, right? So we think about going back and giving back, reach as we climb, and sort of lifting, right, other people up with us. And so, unfortunately, we don't have enough social structures that do that help and assist in those regards. So imagine if we had, right, financial incentives,
Hmm.
right, for people to be teachers. Imagine if we had financial incentives for people to teach in rural areas. Imagine if there were financial resources for doctors to go in rural areas. We had one hospital, right,
Wow.
and the hospital was always closing, right, under different management, under different owners, right. It was rated almost one of the worst
Hmm.
hospitals several years in a row, right. It was literally people joked in my town about, if you want to die, go to Warden County, right. You know
Jeez.
what I mean? So it was always like you had to go to Houston, and Houston was still 50 miles away. So you might not think that's a lot, but when you
But
don't
when
have
you're
a
in,
car,
hmm,
you're in rural America. A lot of people, older folks, black folks, older and middle-aged black folks, a lot of times didn't have sufficient cars that could get them to Houston. They had cars that could drive them around town, right? But not necessarily that could make it to Houston and back without, being stopped, or without, dying on them, right? Without having to see a mechanic, right? So those type of
hmm,
structural challenges that just seem like basic needs that you should be able to provide for yourself. We can't take that type of stuff for granted, because it's those simple things that people are struggling with every day, and we keep telling people it's their fault. It's their fault for
exactly.
being poor, even though the data shows that regardless, that if you're born poor, more than likely, right,
You're
more than
gonna stay
50%
poor.
likely, you're going to stay poor because of those sort of previous things that I sort of mentioned earlier.
So
This cycle of poverty. And,
the financial incentives, that's a different look on it than I actually thought about, which I really appreciate and do agree with. I want to go back into the problem with policing.
mm-hmm,
'Cause that's like just the major thing we have going on now. Even though I am liking, I actually have one question before that. When you're in this rural town in Texas, it's a southern town, and you had about half of the town being minority and half of it being white. So, did you experience a lot of community, or was there still? I know it's in the South, so I'm not sure, but was there a lot of racism, or did it seem almost like there's more of a community that we're all in this together, we're all lower class, like type deal?
um, that's a interesting. It's a good question. because even and we often think of the South in very interesting ways, right? We think the South is backwards and it's very different from the North and the Northeast. I don't think so. I actually saw just as worse, this sort of very similar things in New York, or that
Hmm.
I saw in the South. So I think that's one thing that we probably should challenge. But on that note, so within the small town that I lived within a community even smaller, that largely we called it Foggy Bottom. And Foggy Bottom, it mainly consisted of my family members. So maybe no more than 100 people, 150 max. A lot of land, a lot of cattle, right? So right across the street from us was one of the largest ranches, the second largest Brahmin ranch in Texas, um, who were multi millionaires because of cattle. Um, but so it didn't seem, it was so weird because it didn't seem as though we were actually poor because we lived in
Right next
proximity to
to it.
some wealth, right? We lived in proximity to, so you see a lot more of that happening in rural America than you probably would in suburbs, um, right? To where people in suburbs typically live according to their class, right? Ethnicity, right? So in New York, for example, right, you have Jewish neighborhoods, you have Caribbean neighborhoods, you have West African or West Indian neighborhoods, you see what I mean there?
Yeah, you
Um,
even see that in bigger cities like or smaller cities like Boston too.
right in Boston, right, you have Irish neighborhoods, you have German, right, people where people cluster, and I think a lot of that is about community, right? It's not necessarily, some of it is about, right, redlining and gentrification and, right, all those other, white supremacy and white flight and all those other things. But some of that, essentially, at the heart of, is about community. Where do you feel most safe? Where do you feel that you have resources? And so I felt a community, strong sense of community because I was surrounded by family. And so for us, it was always, if we didn't have something, we knew our cousins next door did, right? And so we could easily go ask for, oh, we need this. Can we borrow this? And vice versa, right? So it was a very like, we grew. Most of our family were gardeners and farmers, and so it was always, a bunch of sharing of crops and harvest and all those other types of. Or my grandma would cook for, you know, her brother and other people, right, in our neighborhood who were ultimately family members. And even if they weren't family, we've treated them as family members, right? Because that's, we're committed. We were committed to that. We were
It
committed to. I've always felt that
it kind
to
of
community. So
reminds
I
me
didn't.
of how the Italian family structure is too, and like they all live in the same home, and you see bigger homes with more people from grandparents to grandchildren, and it's kind of the same type of family structure, um, except maybe different households for you.
Right, different households, but I mean, oftentimes we had a revolving door. My grandma, I lived with my grandmother, and so she had a revolving door policy, pretty much. That anytime somebody was down on their luck and needed somewhere to stay, that was either her kids or her grandkids or nieces or whatever. They knew that they could always come back there. So right, so it was home, right? So it wasn't just our house. Sure, it was, but it was more of like, this is a family sort of house, right? That people knew that they could come back there when things weren't good, and when they needed a little help, right? Or they needed some food to be fed, right? Something like, or just to feel loved, right? People came there, and so I felt rich. I felt wealthy, to be quite honest with you. I
Hmm.
felt wealthy because we were wealthy in love, right? We had all of that. And even in the school that I attended, you know, white, predominantly white teachers and students, but, it felt that we were all in the same plight. Even though I know now we were not in the same plight. They were not
Hmm.
dirt poor. Not they weren't rich either, but they were not dirt poor. And so it was a very sort of communal, sense of
Feeling.
a feeling of belonging, that you belonged and that you compete with white folks because you were all in very similar places, and you were equally as talented, if not more talented than them,
Hmm. Uh,
because you had to work harder for certain things.
hmm.
But yeah, so
Um, I think that's important too. Is really see where from when you came from and your experience, and when you give this example of we talked about this a little bit in our pre-interview for people listening. We talked about how there are nuances, but we are all human, and we're all given different hand in life in terms of what you're dealt. I think it's important to realize that the family structure that you saw that was very supporting and helpful. We can all, like that's the reason I made the point of it's kind of like the Italian family structure. I think media and what we're dealt is putting us in a position where we think we might be different colors or races or whatever, but we're all human. We do get dealt different hands, but we're all in this together. Some of us may have advantages and some of us may have disadvantages, but we're all extremely similar, just having nuanced differences. So our experiences are seem much different, but at a core, their effects on who we are as people and how similar we are to each other in terms of feelings and emotions are pretty close. I don't know if you agree with that, but I think.
Jimmy, yeah, can I go back to that point almost because I'm thinking still, right, as we're talking, new
Mhm,
ideas are coming. And I think of, ways that I was accepted and ways that, people, my cousins were not accepted in certain
mhm.
ways. And other black folks in my school, and it was a handful of black folks in my school. Literally, I could count on like
One
two
hand.
hands. Black
Yeah.
people, and it was a small school, so we had like 250 people in the whole high school. But um, I was accepted in ways because I was willing to perform a version of whiteness that other people either could not or did not want to, right? And so by that I mean, right, I catered to, had a largely white friend base. I, fell in line with social cues of whiteness. I knew what I could do, what it took to be successful. I knew that I could speak their language. Right, I was in the speech and debate team. I was a very, competitive debater, state ranked debater. I was speech and drama, and right, I was a pretty good actor, and I was played football. I was in band, and I excelled at my academic sort of coursework, and so I was in those sort of networks, right? So I had access to things, right, or to
Mhm.
conversations that they would have, and what I found in those conversations is that you know they always treated me and always said reminded me, but you're not really black. You're not really black though. You're not them black people. You're different. You're more like us. You know what I mean? And that's a and and part of me kind of sighs when I hear that because I sort of played into that. I bought into that, thinking that I was not like them, and that therefore I could pass, this sort of white test. And looking back, I probably want to vomit now thinking about some of the shit that I participated in. Um, but I say that to say this: almost every white American, regardless of intentions or not, and this is essentially what I think they were saying. Almost every white American, and I'm paraphrasing James Baldwin, knows that they don't want to be black, right? They don't know what the hell I want or what I need, but they know that they don't want to be black or they don't want to be in proximity to blackness because it means something in the world, right? And it means something, right, quite negative. And so, what they were conditioning and sort of positioning me as is that you might not want to be black either, right? Because you represent this sort of standard of excellence that we associate with what white middle class folk do. Um, because I was privy to those things. Like, I knew how to play the game, even though I didn't have any of those sort of social resources to really, play the game. But I did, and I succeeded at it. And I succeeded at it. And at what cost, I don't know right now. But I think there was, and maybe is a cost that I paid for that. And so I think about that belonging. That goes back to that sort of
Yeah.
conversation about belonging.
Hmm.
It was weird, so weird because I was accepted and oftentimes heard some of the most racist shit in my friend group, right? Because they
Hmm.
thought they could say those type of words around me because I wasn't really black, you know.
That's an interesting take.
So, and that's
Which.
not unique to me though.
Mhm.
That's not unique. You can ask almost any black person who has, some formal education beyond high school, college education, graduate school, and they will probably tell you the exact same thing. They've been around white friends,
Mhm.
and they will say some crazy stuff because they assume that you're not those type of black people, and by that
I think
so that's interesting. I always think.
I think that is interesting, and I think that has to do with just stuff that is maybe ingrained in our society from for a long time, and that is definitely something that needs to be changed. The point I was just trying to make was that you're right. You're there's a difference between cultures, but that's what I'm saying. We all have different experiences. Is in the pre-interview you brought this up is like you're gonna have experiences that are much different than me, and especially when it comes along with culture. But my point being is, yeah, same thing for someone that is Asian American rather than
Right,
white American or
right.
Black American, or African American. My apologies, that was not the correct terminology. Um, but we're all humans, and that's the key point here is we have to humanize each other. I want to go in and break down personally what I think
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the problem we're having with cops, which it does need reform. I think
Mm-hmm.
many people agree with this. I don't necessarily agree with defunding the police, though,
Mm-hmm.
because if you break down how I've broken down the roots of the problem after a long, long thought, I think it's being portrayed as racism, which it partly is, but not on an individual
Mm-hmm.
aspect of cops. It's more of not systematic, but law side of things. So if you look at the war on drugs, I think it's the main peddling problem of why cops are believed to be racist now, and the main reason that people that are in the lower class and or minorities find themselves having more encounters with the police. So I think that's the real issue here is for one, there is a lack of training. There's three main parts to this. The stress we put on police officers, the war on drugs, and mental health, actually. So when you go into the reason behind the reasons we find that African American or even Latino American people get pulled over, a lot of it has to do with suspicion of drugs. They pull you over for not having your blinker on when you make a turn or something like that. And you're driving a beaten up car. So they're like, oh, this guy's going to have drugs on him. So they go and they search your car, they bring the dog and everything. And that creates this dynamic of inequality in terms of traffic stops and or house arrests and stuff like that, or even just being harassed by police officers. But we have to ask how much has if you want to get drugs, you can get drugs. Doesn't matter who you are. So how is the war on drugs helping us, and why is it targeting these people in lower class communities that are being put down for being poor? If we were to stop the war on drugs, would we alleviate and decriminalize drugs and put that money into different facets? Would we alleviate a lot of the problems that minorities have with police? Along the side of, do police get enough training? Not really. And do we evaluate their mental health? Because every single cop has PTSD. It's just undiagnosed. When you're walking up to a car, cops put their finger on the back of they touch the back of the car to leave their fingerprint just in case they get shot every single time because they're scared that they don't know who has a gun, who doesn't. So they're afraid every time. If you're afraid of that every day and you're doing that 8 hours a day, who knows how much PTSD you have, and who knows if you can make the correct decision after being having that much stress on you every day for 30 years, and how much you change as a person. So I think there's three. Those are the three main factors in terms of having. They should be training as much as Navy SEALs train 16 months for a 6 month deployment, and we have cops that get 8 hours of training a year or whatever it is in that certain place. We have to really look at that. But
Yeah, I think that's a interesting take. I would probably disagree with a lot of that,
mm-hmm,
but that's okay. And I'll tell you my reasons for why I would disagree.
mm-hmm,
Um, we can only say, right, it's an issue of training when, right, we've seen, right, a lack of training, and then we see, right, increased training and more resources dedicated to training, right? Or we don't see that, right? When we don't see resources dedicated to train police or even discourse or conversations about that, right? Over the last 30 years, right, police have probably received more training than they've ever received in terms of cultural sensitivity, right? Owing to sort of black resistance movements pushing police, right, to have these sort of cultural sensitivity trainings and discussions about race and discussions about over policing poor neighborhoods or economically vulnerable neighborhoods, right? We've seen more resources dedicated to training over the last 30 years. Yet we have death rates of Black Americans and Brown Americans that nearly triple those of the 70s and 80s, right? So I don't think we can empirically, right, say that it's an issue of training at that point. We can say it's an issue of right systemic failures, right, and we can talk about the natures of what that of those systemic failures and whether how that cuts across right class, right, how that cuts across gender, race, um, and whatever, right. But also I also think you mentioned a point about um, the sort of stressors, right, that cops experience,
mm-hmm.
um, sort of undiagnosed PTSD or being afraid. Um, I do think there's some credibility to that, but here's also my own witness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you can't say that cops are any more afraid than Black Americans are afraid to drive on the street, right? To be subject to at any
Mm-hmm.
moment to unlawful, right,
I
arrest, to unlawful brutality, right? So I mean, Black people have known, right, since right the 18 and 1700s, right, that police meant no good for them, right? That police could stop them for anything that they designed reasonable, and subjected to all types of forms of scrutiny and terror. And so there has always been this, right, particularly stressful relationship, right, between Black people and police because of these sort of unmitigated stops, these unmitigated patrols. We know from the 1800s, particularly around Reconstruction, when you start seeing the rise in lynchings of Black men in particular, and Black women, right, that police oftentimes were in cahoots with the KKK or members of them, right, who would assist these white terrorists, right, in um, taking Black people from the jailhouse to go lynch them without any sort of recompense, right? You see what I mean there? And so that sort of trust in police is not, and nor has it ever been, I think, a thing that Black people can appeal to, and rightfully so. Um, Another thing that I would talk about, and let's talk about, I think you mentioned the war on drugs, and I think that's a good point that we should sort of rest with and start and talk with more about. I saw something the other day and it kind of made me laugh, but it was about like if you want to find drugs, just go to the nearest college campus. You know what I mean? And they're loaded
Yeah.
with all types of drugs. You see what I mean?
Hmm.
And it's not black people who are at largely in college. You
Hmm.
see what I mean?
Yeah,
Right?
I know
It's
exactly what you mean.
middle class white folks, and I don't mean weed because I don't think weed is a drug,
No,
right?
it's not. It should be
You know,
legalized everywhere, but
right? It's every major drug, cocaine, crack, right? All types of pills because they have access to those things, right? They get them from their parents or their parents' friends or their own sort of friend networks, right? I saw more drugs from my college roommate who was a wealthy, he comes from a really wealthy neighborhood suburb of Dallas,
hmm.
and I had never seen that many drugs, or I didn't even know what half of those things were. And he was just selling these things around campus or popping them himself. You know what I mean? I was like, my people would never do this, right?
Yeah.
Would never. And yet we're penalized for selling weed, a dime bag, right? Or
Hmm.
a small sack of weed, or less than an ounce. So
Well,
you know what I mean? So and those types of things are what types of drugs we even criminalize are really interesting, right? In the 80s, you see the sort of when the crack epidemic really sort of takes
well,
off, so to speak, or becomes a sort of something that we can no longer neglect. Right at the same time, right, we were seeing crackdowns on crack cocaine,
much
but no
worse
really down on right the
on
powder
powder
cocaine.
cocaine. Nothing at
You see what
all.
I mean? And
Well,
so, very unequal charges, if any, related to that,
well,
right?
there.
Because one, so I think they're
Agreed.
steeped in that.
I agree. I agree with you. I took. You're familiar with Such a Holly, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I took multiple of his classes, and one of them there's actually tapes that you hear that has to do with the founding of the war on drugs, and it's literally uh, to continue with its nature is steeped in racism. It's literally meant to suppress Black Americans, and that's why I think that it's the main draw of many of these problems. Given there is history that you mentioned, which I agree with, that is all factual. I also think that the media um, is peddling a much worse story in terms of social media, especially than because we're not seeing all the good encounters that happen with cops. Also, there's a lot of
Right.
good people out there that are cops, but we also have to take into mind that if you're seeing, you get into the mean world theory, which I mentioned on my last podcast,
Mm-hmm.
where if you're seeing these videos without any context, with knowing what happened, and you're seeing an African American get shot down or killed or arrested or beaten, which I'm not saying it's justified in general just to shoot someone for being committing a crime. But if you're seeing that every day, you're more apt to be afraid and be terrified and be subject to the stress that you're talking about feeling. And I agree. I don't know if it's as if we're being told to be more afraid, then we should actually be afraid of encounters with police officers nowadays in comparison. Maybe the 1980s was much different and 1990s was much different, but I think nowadays with the advent of body camera or body cams and such, we're in a much different place in terms of, for one, how cops have to act, but also we have to take into consideration what was the point you made? You're making a point on it was the first one you made.
Um,
I know you
was
have
that about? No, it was about. I
apologies.
think no, the
The
one
training,
piece of
the
the training,
training.
right? What you get
So
for the training.
there might have been more training, but I think the main thing is how to put this correctly is beyond me. So I'm just going to kind of hope it gets across correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Even if there was more training, we didn't have body cameras back then, for one, and there was a lot of people that were in it for power. But once you understand how training works, especially with if you look at this is a much more strenuous example, but how Navy SEALs train, they literally put people in these situations, which cop training doesn't really do. But
Mm-hmm.
they create the environment. They literally have like simulated like Middle Eastern towns with role play actors that put the people in the worst possible situation they could be in, the SEALs or whoever they're training in the worst possible position, and see how they deal with it. And then they go and do it again and do it again. And if you're not getting the repetition, just like anything like learning guitar or doing this or that, you're not going to have the proper skills to deal with that. And even though there was more training implemented over the past 30 years, it's not enough. And like I said, like we need to be training at least 20% of the time they're working. That needs to be going into reps to be able to be good at what they do.
Yeah, can I jump in on
Yeah,
that point?
of course.
Yeah, so even as you talk about training, and I agree to some extent about the
Mm-hmm.
sort of nature of training, but at the same time, we're seeing efforts that sort of I think cut that training or that really sort of
Mm-hmm.
roll back that training, right? So even as we're seeing more
Agreed.
training, we're seeing increased militarization of police,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you're taught to be trained to be culturally sensitive, but at the same time you're getting competing messages that you're being more militarized when you go into certain neighborhoods over a damn protest, right? Um, than you are right in white neighborhoods. You see what I mean? Training really
Yeah.
kind of goes out the window because what you're being taught in that very moment is that you should be afraid for your life, right? Whether that's justified or not, that you should be more afraid for your life. And so by having sort of militarized weapons that are, that no country probably even could even rival at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that that sort of competing interpretation is that you should use that weapon.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean? That's the sort of symbolically and discursively what's being constructed there is that if we're being militarized, it means that we're supposed to be militarized and that we're supposed to use it against certain people who we think are danger. So I really think this conversation comes back to vulnerability again. Who
Mm-hmm.
do we think deserves safety, and who do
Mm-hmm.
we think serves as a threat to that safety? Who do we think is
Yeah.
dangerous? And more times than not, and this is research, this is not just conjecture, right? Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's black men who we think are oftentimes dangerous, right? Think about, right, and we can see, go back to studies about, like, and I felt this and seen this myself, right? I could walk down the street and a white woman is walking by and she'll clench her purse,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or she'll lock her doors in her car even though they've already been locked to signal to you that she thinks you're a danger to her, right?
I
And
think that has to do with a lack of.
who believe? They're gonna
Mm-hmm.
believe a white woman who clenches her purse over actually whether the black man actually did anything to her, and we know that that extends into. I was just reading Ursula Orr's book on lynching, right? And we see, right, that
Mm-hmm.
even in the Reconstruction, where all white women had to do was even to say that a black man looked at her
Yeah.
for charges of rape to be levied,
I mean,
and
look at
then
Emmett Till.
right, and then claims of right, and then all of a sudden, white civilians would take it into their own hands, and that man and his family could be lynched
Mm-hmm.
without any other sort of justice being sort of pursued. Right,
I,
nobody would find that white man and say, "Why did you lynch him? Did you have grounds for that?" No,
mm-hmm.
no. It was accepted that he was a criminal and that he was automatically deserved the death that sort of was wielded at him and towards him. And so I have very little faith in any sort of methods of policing because we often have to think about recruitment efforts, Jimmy. I think if we're going to talk about training, we often need to think about who we're recruiting
I think that's. I agree. I
to
agree
be to be
completely.
to
There
be
needs to
police
be more
officers.
screening too
Right,
with
because
who
oftentimes
becomes cops.
right, because oftentimes when you think about who becomes police officers, a lot of times it's people who were in the military, right? So they're very familiar with
Mm-hmm.
militarized weapons, right? So that's one thing. They do probably have a strong level of PTSD. So imagine
Mm-hmm.
that already coming into a volatile situation to you might be you don't know how to de-escalate conflict, right? And you're already scared of a group of
Yeah.
people, so you're already
I
taught that you should be afraid, so you're already heightened. You see what I mean? So it doesn't
yeah,
matter at
I
the
can
end of
somewhat agree. I somewhat
yeah,
disagree with the militarization. I think the understanding and fear of each other is the big problem there. See, I
right,
personally,
absolutely, and we can say
yeah,
that, and
I
we and
think
I
it's the
think
understanding of cultures, which I think both, well, mainly white people have a negative look towards being afraid. I think also there's on the other side too. We see it where um, many, I don't like to generalize, but there is a large uh, or many examples of African Americans just classifying people as racist because they're white and they don't necessarily say the correct terminology or something, and they're labeled as racist immediately. When I mean, that's not fair either.
well,
That's
and I
also
think we have to think about the different. And on that note, Jimmy, I think we have to talk about those conversations between prejudice
exactly.
and racism. So
Mm-hmm.
I think you can be, and some people we have very some people have very different philosophies that
Mm-hmm.
regardless of where you stand on the ladder, that if you're white, you're an agent of white supremacy. In some regard, I think you benefit from that, even if you're not an active white supremacist. You see what I mean? Because you would always benefit from white supremacy because of the founding of this country that privileges white men to be
Mm-hmm.
positioned in certain ways and be given the benefit of the doubt, right? You're given the benefit of the doubt more times than not, right? Whereas I'm probably subjected to more scrutiny and questioning. That's not always true. Let me be clear,
Yeah.
right? There are particular examples to which could easily contest
I.
what I'm saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
But generally, right, and empirically, we across the board, right? And there's another debate about particularity and generalizability, right? And we see across the board that more times than not, white Americans are given this sort of benefit of the doubt. Like, so for example, if they're
Especially with the war on drugs.
with drugs, right? More
Yeah,
times than not,
exactly. Why don't we loop
they
back to that? Because
agree.
I think you have a huge point here, and I agree with you that we are given the benefit of the doubt. And I honestly really think most of this goes back to the war on drugs because I'm sorry to hijack what you're saying.
No, no, it's
Um,
fine. I like the conversation.
I I really do think this has to do with the war on drugs and why we're seeing many of the problems we're seeing today in terms of with racial issues. If that is that the correct terminology is my question
Yeah,
because I
yeah.
don't know if that's what, but most of the reason why people are getting pulled over, harassed on the side of the road has to do with drugs. If we look at the war on drugs, it's not doing anything for us. It's not doing anything but would it be gentrification or suppression of minorities in America that are only given to work a job where, and even lower class people in general, like there's a lot of people that are given the option for mobility, and the only way they're able to do it is work their ass off 80 hours a week for minimum wage or go to school and attempt to make something of themselves and not get anything from it, or stay home, sell drugs, make a lot of money, and just live that life. And when you're given
Right.
those
Often,
options,
yeah. So yeah, speaking of that, Jimmy, oftentimes do think, right, when we think about drugs, oftentimes we don't talk about mental health at the same time,
oh, that too.
right? And so we don't talk about resources. So oftentimes we know that more than likely people sell drugs, right, because they need money, right? Or people are addicted to drugs, usually because there's some trauma there. There's some, undiagnosed, right, mental health issues, untreated mental health issues. There's issues of, people not feeling right, like they belong in the world, right? So this existential loneliness, this existential catastrophes of people not feeling loved and like they could contribute to their families, right? These are issues of resources, right? And until we have a serious discussion about that, who deserves rehabilitation, right? More times than not, if you're poor, you're not going to be able to get in a good
Mm-hmm.
rehab because you don't have
It's so
insurance.
expensive.
It's very expensive. A good rehab, right?
Hundreds of thousands of dollars just being poured into that.
right? Or if you're thrown in a rehab, right? Usually it's some subpar rehab that you can come in and out, and you're still never completely stopped ever doing the drugs. You just went to the rehab so you can get back to your life and go back on your job. You see what I mean there, right? Or as
Hmm.
opposed to if you're middle class and you're a good worker and you have some education, people are going to have some faith in you, especially if you're a good worker, because usually there's like job policies that I know people personally. I know people whose jobs have sent them to rehab and paid, with their insurance, these big ass bills, right? Two, $3,000, $4,000 a week type of bills. You see what I mean? Because they
Yeah.
trusted that person, they wanted that person, right? So that's about a network. It's about building a network of people who think that you can be saved, whatever that might mean, or and so I don't think we have enough. We don't really take, I think, restorative justice and holistic
No.
justice, I think, seriously. We just think of punitive ways we can punish people for violating, right, these social rules that are already, some of them are egregious already, and we're at the foundation. They are white supremacists at the foundation, right? Or they're
Hmm.
ridiculous, right? So but whatever, for whatever reason, right, we punish people, and the people that often seemingly keeps getting punished
Yeah, and it
is
doesn't make
is,
sense either.
is the same people, and black people are fed up,
Hmm.
right? And so going back to your
Understandably.
question of sort of resistance and Black Lives Matter, right, this is a cry of we're fed up.
Yeah.
Black people are fed up, and not even only black people, right, but other people who have joined the Black Lives movements, in the struggle for black freedom. People are fed up, with all these different sort of issues wherever they fit on that spectrum, um, of not feeling that they could survive in their own country, that their ancestors helped build, right?
Hmm.
That building. You see what I mean?
Hmm.
And there seems to be this
So
unjust, unspoken sort of social relationship to where white people, right, seemingly, right, keep benefiting, even though it's on the back of these sort of black and brown folks. So all of those things I think are tied up into my answer of what I think it means, what policing means to
yeah,
a person.
I think it would take generations to
Right.
generations for one from starting in the right direction to rebuild the trust and positive nature. But right now we're still in a time. I think we can agree that if you look at Portugal, they decriminalized all drugs and dropped their overdose rate to under 50%. I think it was in something like 2 or 3 years. Same thing with Sweden. They opened they decriminalized drugs and opened, I want to say opiate clinics. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but where you go there, and if you use heroin or any other type of opiate, you'd go and you could use the drug under supervision so you didn't overdose, and it was free, and they were able to um, they're still open, these clinics, but now they're barely used because everyone kind of found meaning in life, because they were given the help they needed to get back to it. There's more to that, and I don't think the numbers I gave are exactly correct. But all these different situations where instead of punishing people, like you're saying, we should be rebuilding them back up. So, what is the point of the war on drugs? What happens to America if we decriminalize all drugs, which seems like a negative thing to a lot of people, but put that money back into rebuilding uh, our rehabilitation systems, or kind of
Or
just building them up to begin.
right, or education systems, right?
That
We
too.
know we cut funding from education at record rates, and we know, right, there's data, right, that by the third grade, right, people testing scores, people decide how many more prisons they should build,
Mm-hmm.
right, by how many people students learn reading and math, right? We know that, and yet we keep de-investing in education, and so this is, at this point, this is malicious and strategic efforts to
Mm-hmm.
undermine, any sort of achievements or any efforts to promote racial justice or restorative justice because we're not contributing to the infrastructure of our nation that allows people to succeed. And so until we have that
Um,
honest discussion about how resources are allocated, everything else is moot to me.
okay. Yeah, I agree. I think that this just came up into my head, but maybe given the negative association between or relationship between African Americans and police in the past, are we seeing police almost be scapegoated, not completely, but due to the actual systematic, where we should be blaming the laws with the war on drugs more so than we should be blaming individual officers, with exception to
Right.
obviously the case of George Floyd, because I think 90% of 99% of people, except for those assholes on the side, agree that was fucking terrible. But
Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, I think you're right on to the point about right policing as a systematic sort of issue. No one is going. Well, I don't know a lot of people. I'm not gonna say no one because I can't speak for everyone.
I
But
think
not a
there's a
lot of
lot of
people.
assholes out there. Let's
Right.
just put it
Not a
that
lot of
way.
people are going around right criminalizing individual cops. Right, despite what we might hear. Right, you hear people. A critique is being leveled at the systematic level because we
Mm-hmm.
all have police officers in our families, right, in our friend circles, who we know to be good people, who we
Mm-hmm.
know to be doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing. That's not the critique, right? But you're not going to talk about good apples when, you know, 96% right of people who are shot by police are black folks, right? You see what I mean, right? You're not going to talk about good apples. Sure, they're good apples, but we're going to deal with the harm because that's the overwhelming encounter and experiences with black
Mm-hmm.
Americans is the harm, not the
Yeah.
good. So of course, right, when you talk about the sort of theory about the bad world theory, right? The reason that it has so much salience, right, is because when you live that, it's very different from seeing that on TV.
Mm-hmm.
You live that, right, and you start feeling that, right? You feel that at any moment you could be subjected to police violence or state violence, and you could be killed for anything. And so that weighs on you. You know what I mean? That begins to weigh on you, and so you are afraid of police, and
Yeah.
they're afraid of you. And there's nothing you can do to change that relationship at all.
Mm-hmm.
They have to change their relationship to themselves and to what it means to be a police and what it means to pursue justice and to protect folks and serve all these other things that I'm probably not qualified to really speak on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, yeah, we have to really seriously, I think,
I.
interrogate our notions um, of citizenship, our
Mm-hmm.
notions of belonging, right? Our notions of um, violence, who can wield it, when is it wielded, right? We don't talk about, um, we only talk about violence when it's leveled, when black people are doing it, or when other people that don't look white seemingly do it in the streets, right? If we're talking about protest and resistance, oh, well, they're breaking, mirrors in Walmart. Walmart has $1 billion, right? We don't talk about, right, the ways that those companies like that are predatory on vulnerable neighborhoods, right? Oftentimes, how they, right, or erect
Mm-hmm.
these sort of buildings that dislocate people from their homes, right? Because they can buy up all this property and kick people literally out of homes. We don't talk about all that type of stuff until we talk, I think, have a serious discussion about corporate responsibility, right? If there ever can be such a thing, and until we talk about sort of how ways corporations sort of participate in gentrifying neighborhoods, right? The moment you
Mm-hmm.
see a Whole Foods in Harlem, I know there's a problem. You see what I mean? Right,
Yeah.
right in the downtown of Harlem. You see what I mean? Then
Mm-hmm.
that means somebody has gotten kicked out of their home that they've probably lived in for years.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's no longer that neighborhood. All of a sudden becomes no longer affordable because a Whole Foods is there. So guess what? Taxes go up, and guess what? Rent is going up, so they can pay the tax. Landowners can pay
Mm-hmm.
the taxes. So all those things sort of I think participate in policing
Yeah.
and making
I
neighborhoods quote unquote dangerous.
Yeah. I think you make a lot of good points there, and I can agree with most of what you're saying. Except I don't think no detriment to what you're saying or anything, but I don't think 96% of people that cop shoot are African American or minority individuals.
No,
Um,
but I'm saying
I get your
there's
point, though. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify so that
right.
it doesn't come off that you were
Absolutely.
making that statement. I think there is a lot of violence in between too. Um, the other point I was going to make was that I think the visceral feeling of living that experience rather than seeing it in terms of the mean world theory. Um, I think that plays into it. Honestly, is the point I'm trying to make is that there is this dynamic that we're facing. But I think the fix, honestly, that people should be asking for is the end of the war on drugs because it might not fix everything, but I think it's a start in the right direction in terms of for social justice, in terms of uh, bringing down this veil of misunderstanding of each other, and to a lot of unneeded violence and unneeded suppression towards people that just need help. And to go along with that, we just need to understand each other better through humanizing each other, like what you and me are doing right now.
That sounds so right, and that sounds so simple, right?
It's not as easy as that. It's not.
You can only say it and wish it and hope for it to come. You know, it's something that you have to fight every day, and you have to fight it on interpersonal levels just as much as you have to fight it on sort of systematic levels. Um, because people are hurting everywhere, you know, regardless of where you stand across racial and ethnic lines and economic lines. People are hurting for various
Mm-hmm.
reasons, and James Baldwin tells us, right, that our suffering should not isolate us, but that our suffering should be a bridge to other people to connect us. And a lot of people are feeling disconnected and alienated. I mean, we're in a pandemic and we
Yeah,
literally
exactly.
can't touch people, can't be around friends, can't be around loved ones, and things like that. So I think people are really hurting for all these variety of reasons, and I don't really know
Mm-hmm.
what we're gonna do about that. And we can just hope for the wait for the turning of the tides. You know, because I believe and maybe many of us may believe that the tides will turn, and what that will look like, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it might not be something we've seen before, but it might be. Who knows? But if you got hope, you just wait, and while you wait, you work for a better world. Because we fight for democracy every day, and
Exactly.
our responsibility to keep renewing it and keep perfecting it, even when we think it's no longer salvageable. That's the great, I think, responsibility that we have before us, until we, take that responsibility as our own.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll probably be fighting this fight for another 300, 400 years, long as civilization survives.
Yeah, I agree.
That's
I
my take on.
I think we just need to step in the right direction. Honestly, I have one more major question to ask you about
Okay.
all that, and then maybe we can wrap things up. I would love actually. I think we could honestly go on for hours, and between you and me, I honestly think we could figure out almost maybe solutions to this because the difference, the way we're talking in comparison to how people are talking on social media and even politicians with the lack of leadership is we're what people don't get is you need to we might be disagreeing here.
Right.
We come from different backgrounds, we come from different experiences, but for me to not just listen to you but to understand where you're coming from and understand your experiences, to understand why you've come to the reasons for the way you believe in your opinions, lets me humanize you and want to make everything good for you as much as I want, so we can come to a compromise, which is why this time is so feels so polarizing, because we're isolated at home from each other. For the past 4 years, we've been listening to each other, but no one's been understanding one another. We'll have conversations like this, but we won't take into consideration what you just said. I'll just spew back what I said 5 minutes ago. And that's all the conversation that's been going on now. But once we get to this point where we can understand each other and humanize each other, we can come and make compromise and make things change and progress, maybe slowly, but at least we're making progress rather than this stalemate we've been in for the seeming past 8 years and longer, for the entirety of since who knows when, for in terms of justice for African Americans. There's been no progress in terms of stuff like that. But my question to you has to do with the white hijacking of these protests, where you've seen many videos where African American protesters trying to have a conversation with one of the police officers, and then you see some skinny white kid come up and be like, "Don't talk to him," and yell over them so they can't have a conversation. And there got to be hundreds of videos of it at this point,
Right.
of different situations. But well, what does your say to that, when it seems like these two individuals are trying to have a constructive conversation, and
Well,
then someone that doesn't experience this hops in?
yeah, yeah, I think that also speaks to right movement work, right? The message movement work. Even within movements, even with people on the same side, you still have a level of disagreement, right? So we tend to think that, oh, if you're a Republican, all of you believe this, or if you're a Democrat or you're liberal or progressive, you all believe this, or if you're a radical, you all are about destruction. That's not true, right? We know that there's levels to this shit, right? And there's degrees to which people disagree, even with so internal sort of conflicts, even within movements. And so I think what we're talking about, this issue of sort of white hijacking, um, is not a surprise because it's often, you can rip it out of any, protest case study from the 60s and the 50s and whenever, and you'll see the sort of very similar things too, where, white liberals are inserting their voices in movements dominated by black people. And so you have a different level of agreement amongst black people or disagreement amongst black people about the level of white participation in these movements. I think Black Lives Matter has allowed a number of white people within the movement, and that's their prerogative. Um, but yeah, so there. But just I can say this: all people within Black Lives Matter probably would not agree with certain levels of white participation. In fact, some would probably shun white participation at all, and some would probably welcome it. And that can be seen kind of sort of if you want to think about maybe Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, or Stokely Carmichael and John Lewis, right? These different sort of factions and tensions, even within movements about racial justice. So it's not new, and so
Mhm.
I don't know what I severely think about it yet, but
It's something to look into. I think it's interesting because I think that um, the co-participation is important, but when you're stopping people from actually making the progress they want to find out the root of these problems, maybe for themselves, because they just know there's a problem, they don't know the source of it. When you're hijacking their ability to do that, I think there's an overstepping. I don't know if it's on purpose or because
well, I
they have
think we
malicious
often
intent.
yeah, and I often think within conflict or movements of resistance that are typically built on confrontation, right? We think that any moment of communication with quote unquote the enemy is that we've conceded to them. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, you don't see communication within confrontation. Oftentimes, we don't have language for people communicating with right people in power. the state in this instance, um,
Mm-hmm.
to sort of negotiate or to talk in theory, right, to have rational discourse. Where only sort of, a lot of people only think that emotional responses or rage is the only response that you can have. And again, that's about ideological and philosophical differences. So I'm not critiquing either
Oh
approach, but
yeah.
I'm saying there's deep ideological differences between um, movements approaching specifically. I studied confrontational rhetoric
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
movements in my master's program, and so I know these types of fissions and fractures happen all the time. So um,
Mm-hmm.
it usually gets amplified. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so we make more of that conflict when we see it than maybe what should be made of it. I don't know, um,
Okay.
but it's not foreign to us.
Yeah. So it's been a pleasure. I'm not quite ready to end it, but I think we're gonna have to, if we can find a time, honestly, do a prolonged episode where we honestly literally write down everything we're talking about and discuss possible. Because I personally think we can come up with something to literally just put out there and be like, hey, maybe this will work between the two of us. Being, I'm not the only problem there is I'm not like right wing or anything. I'm more of a centrist, but
Yeah, I'd rather have you.
yeah, yeah, understandably. But at least between you and me, maybe we could bring on someone, but we'll think about it. But if we could find a prolonged episode, maybe a few hours long, if you'd be, I don't know if you have the time, we can discuss after, but where we honestly just take a deep dive into this and try and figure out all the different issues and have like a real roadmap to this. But with that being said, I think there's three main principles that you need in life to be a good human being, or try to be at least, and live a happy life. And I think I've narrowed those down to the balance, the spreading of love, and the respect for others. And when I say respect, I mean like, for one, having respect for them, but also understanding them and where they come from and their experiences. So I was thinking about starting something like saying at the end of every podcast, just being like, remember everyone, balance, love, and respect. And everyone have a good day. Thanks for coming on, Goyland.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Take care now.